Why do we need another podcast about MMA and about the UFC? This is something that I've been thinking about for a really long time. I've wanted to do this. I wanted to have a podcast platform where we could talk openly and candidly about the UFC fights, the ones that are really good, the ones that people want to talk about. And what you have out there in terms of podcasts and YouTube channels and shows on the UFC and MMA at large is you have the Ariel Helwanis of the world who have an agenda. They're at odds with Dana White. They love MMA perhaps, but they have their feuds with MMA media versus the fighters. They have their feuds against Dana White. But as fans, we like Dana White. If you took a survey of all the UFC fans in the world and you did a survey, how many of them approve of Dana White and the way he runs the UFC? Dana's going to have a plus 90% approval rating from the fans. We like Dana White because he keeps it real, he keeps it honest. Are there problems with the way he pays the fighters? Probably. I don't know. I'm just a fan. I enjoy watching the fighters fight, and I want to talk about the fighters fighting. I don't want to talk every episode about, how unfair Dana White is, blah, blah, blah. We enjoy watching the sport. And we enjoy the drama that goes into the fights. And we enjoy watching Sean Strickland. And we enjoy watching some of the other exciting fighters. And we want to see, is Strickland going to fight against Duplessis in a rematch? Is Strickland going to fight against Adesanya? These are exciting times in the UFC. And it gets a little awkward when you have YouTube channels like MMA Fighting, where they have members of the MMA media like Alexander K. Lee go and try to confront Sean Strickland for being, against this group of people and against that group of people. And it just makes it weird and awkward to watch MMA Fighting after Alexander K. Lee goes and does something like that. We want to watch the media talk about the fights and talk about the drama without inserting themselves into it. It doesn't always need to be about you. Why can't we just talk about the excitement with the fights that are going on? Why do you have to make it weird where now it's like, okay, I have to either like Strickland or I have to like the MMA media who are against Strickland, and I have to now say, it's not right when Strickland says this, it's not right when Strickland says that. I enjoy watching what Strickland has to say. He's funny. He's honest. He says what he wants. We don't need to restrict that. But now it's weird because now you have these nerds in the MMA media just picking fights with the fighters where the fighters, they're obviously not going to fight back against the media. I guess they could argue with them, for whatever that's worth. But why do you have to be against him? Why do you have to always go and try to get the fighters canceled? Now I have to pretend that you're not working with a vendetta against Sean Strickland and the fighters every time I watch your show on MMA Fighting? This is why I can't watch them anymore. And this is why it becomes super hard to watch Ariel Helwani. Because you know that anytime Dana White does something wrong, he's just going to jump on it. But meanwhile, watching Dana White is one of the best parts of the UFC. Because there's no other league that operates in the fashion that the UFC does, where the fighters can actually say what they want. They actually have freedom, and the interviews that they get in the press are actually interesting. The post-fight press conferences are interesting. The Octagon interviews are interesting, although they're a lot more interesting when Joe Rogan does them and a lot less interesting when Daniel Cormier does them because he's a horrendous interviewer. But whatever. This is interesting stuff. And one of the biggest problems that the MMA media has is they continually crap on their own fans. They talk openly. They say, we have the stupidest fans out there. Our fans are so dumb, all they want is violence. We have an uneducated fan base. They openly, consistently insult their fans. This is something that bothers me greatly. Why are you insulting the people who watch you? On any episode of Between the Links on MMA Fighting, You have John Morgan insults them, Mike Heck, Jed Meshew, all of these guys, Sean Al-Shadi, they all openly talk about how we have the stupidest fans of any sport. I got news for them. We don't have the stupidest fans. Fans are fanatics. We enjoy watching the sport. We enjoy talking about the sport. We're fanatics. We go crazy about the sport. And all that we want as fans are good fights. And when fights are boring, the fans don't want that. You're going to call the fans uneducated for wanting to watch striking and not watch as much grappling? There should be no problem with that. If I paid for a ticket and I want to go see two fighters in a striking match, that's within my right as a fan. I may not get it. It's a risk when I buy the ticket. Maybe it'll be a grappling match. Maybe it'll be boring. But it's in my right to boo them. It's in my right to cheer for them. It's in my right to do anything within reason while watching these fights. The crowd is there, and the crowd, it provides more entertainment for the viewer. When the crowd is cheering, it's exciting. When the crowd is booing, that adds some excitement, because now you're wondering, what are the fighters thinking? They're getting booed. Are they going to now turn up the intensity? Is that a sign from the crowd to the fighters? There's a communication going on between the fighters and the crowd. There's communication back and forth. The fans are cheering. That means they're happy with what the fighters are giving them. The fans are booing. That means they're unhappy with, the amount of back and forth that's happening here. You had a fight this past Saturday night at the Strickland versus Duplessis fight card where it seems like it was a pretty good fight, but the fans were booing. Why? Why were the fans booing? It was in the Chris Curtis fight against the Canadian guy. Chris Curtis put his hands up. He didn't understand it. He's like, "What? Why? Why is this? Why are we getting booed? We're exchanging in the pocket." But for whatever reason, between Chris Curtis and the guy he was fighting against, there was just the dance partners weren't really working out. For whatever reason, it wasn't that exciting. So the fans were booing. And after the fight, Chris Curtis got on the microphone and he said, "You guys are bloodthirsty." And I think the fans could tell that it wasn't really a horrendous fight, but there was something missing there. The fans aren't stupid. The fans are intelligent. The fans know what they're watching. The fans know when they're watching Alex Pereira versus Yuri Prohaska. The fans know when they're watching Yuri Prohaska versus Glover Teixeira. The fans know when they're watching Brandon Moreno versus Davison Figueiredo. The fans know when there's an exciting fight on. The fans aren't uneducated and stupid. The fans have eyeballs and they know what they're watching. So we need MMA media, or not MMA media. We need the opposite of MMA media, really. We need people who can talk about the sport and not consistently crap on their fans, who are the people who are watching them talk about the sport. And the media just becomes too predictable. Every Helwani show is the same. Then you have him go on his Ringer MMA podcast show, and you have Pizzi and Chuck, and they always bring up the exact points that Helwani wants. They always feed into the opinions of Helwani. They very rarely will go way against what Helwani is going to say, and it's just so tired and boring. And when they have arguments about who's the fighter of the year, and they aren't picking Strickland to be the fighter of the year when he so obviously is. It's just stupid. One guy dominated the year with his victory. That was Sean Strickland beating Israel Adesanya. Israel Adesanya had lost before to Pereira, but that was where Israel won the entire fight, and Pereira got him at the end. Pereira lost 3 rounds out of 4, and then in the 5th round, he caught Izzy and he won the fight. And then Izzy went back and beat him. But the only fighter we've ever seen go against Israel Adesanya and beat him from pillar to post was Sean Strickland. He dominated him. He was the fighter of the year. It was clear. He dominated the news. But it seems like MMA media has their own agenda. That's what led me to starting this podcast. When you have a show like the Strickland vs. du Plessis card, and you have the co-main event, the penultimate fight, is between Mayra Bueno Silva and Raquel Pennington for a vacant title that Amanda Nunes gave up. Amanda Nunes, who was way better than any of the current fighters on the UFC roster in the female divisions. And now you just take the title, which is supposed to be something that's important, something that's prestigious, and you just offer it up to Raquel Pennington, who is like a journeywoman fighter. Okay, she's been in the UFC for a long time, but not a great fighter. Really middle of the road. I understand that the women don't have as many great fighters as the men do. That's just facts. And it's just embarrassing to see Raquel Pennington fighting for another title. Amanda Nunes beat the piss out of her. And it's not like she was some elite fighter who beat everyone else in the division except for Amanda Nunes. She was an average fighter at best. Now she's a champion. She's not a champion on the level of a Rafael Dos Anjos. She's not a champion. She's not even a fighter who would be on the level of a Jim Miller. She wouldn't be on the level of a Cowboy Cerrone. These guys aren't even champions. And you have her fighting against Mayra Bueno Silva, another, middle of the road fighter, and you're going to offer a title? But the UFC commentators are talking about the fight, which it was just an absolutely pathetic fight, where you have Pennington and Bueno Silva just like stalling out on the cage. Silva just like trying to keep back control, not, unable to get a choke in. Pennington can't do anything in the grappling. She's an average striker. And you're going to basically equate their title fight with the Strickland du Plessis title fight and say those two events are equal? The co-main event, the women's bantamweight title fight, was an embarrassment. But you have nobody on the broadcast who's allowed to say that and call it out because they work for the UFC. This is why we need unbiased commentary and a place where we can just talk about the fights for real. And then the other type of podcast that you have, which is amazing, is someone like Jack Slack on the Jack Slack podcast, or the Heavy Hands guys, or one of those really in the weeds podcasts where they're going so in depth into every single fight from prelim to the final fight, where most fans aren't watching the first prelim of the night. We watch maybe the main card. We watch all the fights. We watch the whole event. But what do we want to talk about? We don't want to go in depth into every single prelim fight. We want to talk about the main fights, the main storylines. So that's where this podcast is a little different. I'm not going to talk about the first prelim of the evening. I'm not going to talk about the Bellator fights. I'm not going to talk about, most PFL fights unless maybe Francis Ngannou is fighting, or if there's like some Jake Paul action or something exciting, or a really exciting fighter who comes out of nowhere, like the French guy who Cedric Doumbé, like maybe something like that once in a blue moon. But for the most part, fans don't really want to hear about Bellator. And I understand Bellator was bought by the PFL, but that's not the point. The point is we don't want to necessarily hear about all these other organizations. We want to talk about the biggest and best UFC fights. The UFC is where it's at. That's what we want to talk about. We don't want to talk about who won the weekend. There's like a classic Ariel Helwani, like who won the weekend? Bellator or the UFC or PFL or other? We just want to hear about the UFC fights that were great. We don't want to talk about, really Bellator is coming up. Oh, who's the new second organization that's going to challenge the UFC? It's like, no. We know the UFC is the best. Let's talk about the UFC fights almost exclusively. Let's talk about the best fights. Let's not talk about the fights, the first prelim of the evening. Let's talk about the interesting storylines, and let's keep it at that. These are for the fan. This podcast is that middle ground where we aren't the fight nerds who are, breaking down every second of every single fight from the beginning of the fight card to the end, and every Bellator fight, and catch every highlight from all the other fight organizations, professional and amateur. This is where we're going to talk about the UFC. Maybe we'll talk about the Contender Series a little bit. Maybe we'll talk about the biggest and best storylines. Maybe once in a blue moon, there will be an epic fight going on outside the UFC that we have to talk about. But for the most part, this is the UFC. This is for the middle of the road UFC fan who just want to do straight up fight talk. And that's why this is the Straight Up Fighting Network, the Straight Up Fight Network. And this is going to be the Straight Up Fight Network podcast. And I think it's going to be fun. It's going to be a great ride. And I'm really looking forward to what's going to come in the future on this channel. And this is just the start. This is just the first episode. There's not going to be episodes every day. There's not going to, maybe even not every week, but anytime something big happens, anytime there's something worth talking about in an unbiased, fair way, where I'm not going to be insulting the fans of the sport who make the sport what it is, we'll talk about it here on the Straight Up Fight Network.